Hello, everyone. I'm Libba Beaucham, Director of Media and Communications here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I'm super excited today about our presentation, just in time for this season of spookiness. So I really appreciate all of you for being members and for joining me today. Now, if you have never read any of Edgar Allan Poe's work, his name likely brings up images of darkness and mystery and suspense to mind. And since his first publications in 1827, his short stories and poetry have continued to thrill readers and inspire writers and filmmakers to this day. So today, we are going to take a look at the lived experiences of Poe and the themes that are central to his work. And I'll put it out front, I am not a Poe expert, but I have certainly done my research, and I'm really excited to share what I've learned with you today. So let's get started. So Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, to traveling actors Elizabeth and David Poe. His mother, Elizabeth, pictured here, was a British actress who immigrated to Massachusetts as a young girl after the passing of her father. Her mother was also an actress and had Elizabeth acting on the stages of Boston as a child actor. Now, her mother died when Elizabeth was only 11 years old, and little is known about how she died, but Elizabeth continued acting with the troupe and had quite a successful career as a young actress. She eventually married a man named Charles Hopkins, but he died of an illness only 3 years later, leaving young Elizabeth a widow. And only about 6 months later does Elizabeth meet David Poe Jr., who saw Elizabeth perform in Virginia. And David joins the same acting troupe as Elizabeth, and they marry shortly after in 1806. And the couple continue their respective careers, with Elizabeth being very well received by audiences and David not so much. In fact, I came across a description of him having stage fright, so perhaps he was joining the troupe to get the girl, but Elizabeth certainly had the more successful career. So the couple had 2 children together, William and Edgar. David was known to suffer from alcoholism, and he does eventually abandon the family, and he dies in 1811, and we don't really know what his cause of death was. Elizabeth continues her career now that she certainly depends on it to raise her family, and she also tragically dies in 1811, likely due to tuberculosis. So there's quite a bit of tragedy in the earliest years of Edgar Poe's life, and though he likely did not have any vivid memories of his mother, he did carry this miniature of her his entire life, so he did at least have a strong connection to her memory, as she was his mother. Edgar and his siblings were separated after their mother's death. His brother William lived with their aunt, and Edgar was cared for by a childless and wealthy Virginia merchant named John Allen and his wife Frances, who you can see pictured here. Poe's relationship with John Allen has been described as volatile, as they were both a bit stubborn and headstrong, and in the opposite way, Frances adored Edgar, and they had a very loving relationship. Edgar received an excellent education in Scotland and England when John Allen took the family to Europe for business matters between the years 1815 and 1820. Edgar excelled as a student and was known to have a cheerful personality. He was also known to be quite a sensitive young man who enjoyed poetry. He was also very athletic as a young man, and one example of this is when, at age 15, he swam 6 miles against the current in the James River, which caused quite a sensation in the community. And in his earlier years, Edgar also suffers another tragedy when the mother of a boyhood friend, Jane Stannard, passes away. And Edgar At age 14, was in boyhood love with Mrs. Stannard, who would welcome his visits, lend a comforting ear to Edgar when he was upset. And Mrs. Stannard dies of brain cancer when Edgar is just 15. And in fact, Poe's famous poem that you might know, To Helen, is about Jane Stannard. And Poe wrote in a letter that she was, quote, the first purely ideal love of my soul. And the name Helen refers to the daughter of Zeus. So Helen symbolizes this reverence that Poe had for Jane Stannard. And this poem was written later in Poe's life in 1831, which suggests that he still very much cared for the memory of Jane. So here's that poem, To Helen. To Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the wary, wayworn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand, ah, Psyche, from the regions which are holy land. So really placing her almost literally on a pedestal as this Greek goddess. Edgar, as he gets older, he attends the University of Virginia, and he really excels as a student, and he also captures the attention of his fellow classmates with his art. He would draw on the walls and ceilings of his room and then invite fellow students to hear the stories he had written while in his room surrounded by these drawings. And I was really disappointed to find out that there are no verified drawings or art by Edgar Allan Poe that have been discovered. But there are accounts that he was quite a gifted artist. And while Edgar attended the University of Virginia, he was provided a small, an emphasis on small, allowance from his foster father, John Allen. But it was not enough to sustain Edgar. And so, at least according to him, this is why he gambled in an attempt to gain more money. And this went very poorly for Edgar and got him into $2,000 of debt, which is, of course, quite a sum in the mid-1800s. So as you can imagine, his foster father, John Allen, was not happy about this, and it resulted in a pretty bitter fight between John and Edgar. So Edgar left for Boston, in part for fear of being pursued by those he was indebted to, but he also was not in a good relationship with his family or foster father, I should say, in particular. And so his studies ended at university, and he went to Boston and began to work as a store clerk for a short time. He worked as a reporter for a small newspaper, and then desperate for money and some kind of stability, at 18, he enlists in the army under the name Edgar A. Perry and saying that he was age 22. He was stationed in Boston at Fort Independence, and he spent a short time at West Point, but he then got himself expelled on purpose so that he could leave because he was so dedicated to the idea at that point of becoming a poet. And this greatly angered John Allen, his foster father, even more, deepening this divide between them. While in Boston, Edgar had his first book of poetry, Tamerlane and Other Poems, published by a young printer, only 18 years old as well. And Edgar wrote this anonymously, crediting the book of poetry to a Bostonian, which you can see there in this in the cover. Only 50 copies were printed, and only 12 remain to this day, and only one first edition exists, making it among the rarest first editions in American literature. The poem Tamerlane depicts a story of a Turkic conqueror historically known as Tamerlane. In the poem, Tamerlane forgoes his love for a peasant girl in order to achieve power, but upon his deathbed, he regrets his decision he regrets that decision, and he longs for love. So very much a poem of regret and unrequited love. The poem was revised when he was a little bit older in 1829, but the original is very imitative of the poet Lord Byron, who Poe greatly admired. So keep in mind, Edgar, he's only 18, but it's really interesting to see this piece written at such an early stage of his life, because we can see how he was inspired by Lord Byron, and then we can compare it to his later works to see how he really grows into his own voice. So it's a very long poem, but just to give you a taste of it, here is a stanza that really speaks to that theme of unrequited love and regret. The hallowed memory of those years comes o'er me in these lonely hours, and with sweet loveliness appears as perfume of strange summer flowers, of flowers which we have known before in infancy, which seen recall to mind not flowers alone, but more our earthly life and love and all. So quite romantic, especially for a young 18-year-old. So after leaving West Point, Poe went to New York City, where he wanted to pursue a career as a poet. And there he writes another volume of poems simply titled Poems. This contained some of his well-known poems like To Helen, which we just discussed. And then he moved to Baltimore, Maryland, and wrote the short story Message Found in a Bottle. And this is one of his earliest short stories, and he submitted this to the Baltimore Weekly short story competition, and he unanimously won, and he got $50 for it. And the story is really interesting. It's read like a message in a bottle. Its narrator is a passenger on a cargo ship, and a hurricane sweeps him up, and suddenly he's aboard this big, mysterious ship of old sailors heading southward. And it really does evoke the idea of a ghost ship and the dread of what lies ahead on their journey. So we really get to see some of these themes that are going to reoccur in Poe's work. And the ship eventually reaches Antarctica and the story ends just as the ship gets caught in a great whirlpool and begins to sink. And that brings to mind, I hope you're not afraid of any spoilers. The works are excellent, even if you do know what's coming next, which I think is the sign of a great piece of work. But we will be talking about the actual plots of these stories, so beware. Spoiler alert. So back to Message Found in a Bottle. This story, while it's very rich and has a lot of spooky description, it was interesting because it can also be interpreted quite fairly easily as a satire, because it does really exaggerate elements of classic sea tales. And it is kind of funny that the sailor who is experiencing all of this has the time to write down this tale at length and in such a detail. And there are also some humorous turns of phrases and names like that of Captain Adam Seaborn, and pretty on the nose with that one. But here's one passage that I found that I thought offered both vivid description and a little bit of humor. So, the ship and all in it are imbued with the spirit of eld. The crew glide to and fro like the ghosts of buried centuries. Their eyes have an eager and uneasy meaning. And when their figures fall athwart my path in the wild glare of the battle lanterns, I feel as if I have never felt before, although I have been all my life a dealer in antiquities, and have imbibed the shadows of the fallen columns of Baalbek and Tadmor and Persepolis, until my very soul has become a ruin. So a little bit of vivid imagery in there, describing those ghost-like presences. and saying that I feel as if I have never felt before. They hear these old figures, even though he's extremely well versed in ruins, so much so that his very soul has become a ruin. And another clue that Message in a Bottle, found in a bottle, was intended to be a comedic piece is that Poe wrote the short story Bon Bon during this time, and that short story is without question intended to be humorous. And that depicts a man who fancies himself a bit of a philosopher and his meeting with the devil. And it reads like an interview with the devil as the man interrogates the devil, and we learn what kind of soul the devil enjoys most, that of philosophers. And this piece was printed in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier after being submitted for a competition. And while it did not receive an award, it was published and received very well. So here's a passage from Bon Bon that gives you a glimpse of the vivid description again, but also that personality of the devil. "I see you know me, Bon Bon," said he. "Ha ha ha ha, hee 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 hee, ha 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 ha, ho 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 ho, hoo hoo hoo." And the devil, dropping at once the sanctity of his demeanor, opened to its fullest extent a mouth from ear to ear, so as to display a set of jagged and fang-like teeth, and throwing back his head, laughed long, loud, wickedly, and uproariously, while the black dog, crouching down upon his haunches, joined lustily in the chorus, and the tabby cat, flying off at a tangent, stood up on end and shrieked in the farthest corner of the apartment. So kind of creepy, but also interesting to see the devil have so much personality. So by 1835, Poe was in Richmond, Virginia, and he was working there as an editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. And within a year, the Messenger became one of the most popular magazines in the South because of Poe's sensational short stories and his book reviews, which could be very critical and sensational as well, if not, well, let's just say he may have offended a few people. And it was also during this time, now that Poe is age 27, that Poe was ready to marry. And he had lived with Maria Clem, and who was his aunt, and his cousin Virginia Clem when he was in Baltimore. And when Maria's mother died, she was financially supporting them, they didn't have anywhere to go. So Edgar Allan Poe brings them to Richmond, and perhaps he already had intentions of marrying Virginia, but he does marry Virginia, who was only 13 years old. Virginia, and of course his cousin, which wasn't all that unusual, but to be married that young was a little unusual even for the mid-1800s, in America at least. And Virginia's personality was described as very animated and vivacious, a very positive energy in his life. And by all accounts, she and Edgar had a very loving relationship, though, yet again, in Edgar's life, he suffers a tragedy. In 1847, when Virginia was just 24 years old, she dies of tuberculosis. So just like Edgar Allan Poe's mother. And not too long before her death, she wrote Edgar a poem that read, and this is an acrostic poem, so each of the beginning letters, you'll see if you look down the line, spells Edgar Allan Poe. "Ever with thee I wish to roam, dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home, and a rich old cypress vine, removed from the world with its sin and care, and the tattling of many tongues. Love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see. Perfect ease we'll enjoy, without thinking to lend ourselves to the world in its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful we'll be." So quite sad to read. She knows that her health is not well, and she clearly has a deep admiration and love for her husband, Edgar. Poe was seeking more financial stability. I mean, throughout his life, he does have a lot of financial challenges, especially when he is on his own. And this was still the case even when he had a job at the Messenger, because it simply just didn't pay very much. And he and Virginia, they then moved to New York City and then to Philadelphia, all in hopes of trying to find that financial stability. And he continues to write for magazines, those short stories and poems, as well as being an editor for magazines. And this is the time when his reputation is really growing. And he publishes Tales of the Grotesque and the Arabesque, which included his very popular tale, The Fall of the House of Usher. So The Fall of the House of Usher is a story in which an unnamed narrator, and you'll see a lot of unnamed narrators in the works of Poe, this unnamed narrator receives a letter from a friend who needs assistance because he's fallen ill. And when our narrator arrives, he discovers that his friend's sister is also ill. And there are descriptions of her body contorting and her going into these trance-like states. And then we learn that his brother and sister are the only remaining members of the Usher family. And Roderick, the friend who's sick, tells the narrator that he believes the house is alive. The sister is found and presumed to be dead, so they inter her. And over the next week, Roderick and the narrator become more and more paranoid and agitated, especially because it's important to note that they inter her in the house. And a great storm comes through, and the house seems to really come alive through its creaks and groans. With lightning and thunder crashing, a door opens to reveal the sister, Madeline, seemingly alive. The narrator runs out of the house, and as he looks back, the house comes crashing down. And it's interesting to note that this story was very likely inspired by the Usher estate in Boston, where the bodies of a couple were found when the house was torn down in the 1830s. So here is a snippet of the Fall of the House of Usher. She is coming to ask why I put her there too soon. I hear her footsteps on the stairs. I hear the heavy beating of her heart. Here he jumped up and cried as if he were giving up his soul. I tell you, she now stands at the door. So lots of creepy anticipation. And you can see how he's describing hearing the sounds of the house and believing them to be almost alive, like how he fears his sister might be. Poe continued writing poetry and short stories and editing, just as he was. And the most notable works as he rises to fame include Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, and one of my favorites, The Telltale Heart. So The Murders in the Rue Morgue is considered to be the first modern detective story, and it's this story that really establishes many literary conventions of the genre that you find in Sherlock Holmes, in Hercule Poirot, such as the highly intelligent and perceptive detective character, the personal friend who kind of serves as a narrator and a guide for the reader, and that classic presentation of all the evidence and reasoning prior to the conclusion. Those tropes really started with Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The Telltale Heart has, once again, an unnamed narrator who describes his attempt at the perfect murder, but he is haunted by the sound of an ever louder beating heart to the point of confession. The Pit and the Pendulum is a terrifying tale of a prisoner who is condemned to death, and he's placed, as you can see in this depiction of it, he's placed in this dark room where a large, sharp, and swinging pendulum is slowly descending upon him. And he does manage to escape the pendulum, but then the walls begin to enclose, and it even says they're heated. and it forces him closer and closer toward this deep pit, hence the pit and the pendulum. And I won't spoil that one. That's one of my favorite ones too, but I'll let you read the ending yourself to see if he makes it out alive or not. And then, of course, we come to The Raven. So Poe's publication of The Raven in 1845, this is the piece that really makes him a household name. Poe was even nicknamed The Raven due to its popularity, and there were many parodies and references to it, so it was quite a sensation. But despite this fame, he was still not financially successful or stable. His fame did allow him to draw large enough crowds and for lectures, which did help him financially, but he really was not paid very much for his publications. And he would be an advocate for paying writers more, but he did not really experience financial wealth in his lifetime. So The Raven, we're going to listen to a reading of The Raven at the end of this program, but just to give a brief synopsis, it's a tale of lost love and dark omens. So a lot of those central themes are found in The Raven. It's interesting because it kind of combines his fascination of these morbid ideas and death and decay, but also those ideas of love and especially loss of love. So I think The Raven really exemplifies Edgar Allan Poe's sensibilities, and it's a really great example of his particular voice. This is really when Poe has come into his own with poetry in particular. And during this time, in the 1840s, this was also when Virginia, his wife, her health begins to decline. And by 1847, he and Virginia, they're living in the country in a cottage. They know that it's likely soon that she will pass away. And when she does pass away, Poe is absolutely devastated by her death and could not write for months. And in 1849, a few years later, Poe does reconnect with an old sweetheart, Elmira Shelton, who is now a widow, and they do become engaged. They intend to marry after Poe returns from a trip to Philadelphia and New York, but Poe would not return. On his way to Philadelphia, he stopped in Baltimore, and for the next 5 days, his whereabouts were unknown. And he was found in a pub and taken to a hospital where he did die on October 7th, 1849. So just a few days ago was the anniversary of his death. The cause of his death is uncertain. It may have been due to alcoholism or related heart failure. Just days after Poe's death, a rival author, Rufus Griswold, attempts to put Poe's life and work in a bad light. This is likely because Poe had harsh critiques of Griswold and had offended him. But this attempt did not go as planned because Griswold's obituary of Poe actually drove sales of Poe's work higher than ever. So it's not until Poe dies that his work really just explodes in popularity. And Poe was buried in Westminster Presbyterian Churchyard in Baltimore, and I do believe that you can visit his gravesite today. So the work of Edgar Allan Poe, it remains popular to this day, of course, from the beautiful and melodious poetry of love to terrifying and suspenseful mysteries of darkness and death. And his command of language and rhythm, especially, both in his poetry and in his prose, is that of a true literary master in his own right. His life, as we have learned, was itself full of tragedy, yet he remained idealistic, romantic, and full of imagination. And this is also in spite of his likely having depression. And so I do hope that today's presentation has you excited to read more of his work and perhaps connect with it in a more personal way now that you know more about the man behind the pages. So I would like to conclude now with a reading of The Raven by Poe, of course. And this is read by one of our wonderful volunteers, Victor Lawrence. Victor has a background in theater from Columbus State University here in Georgia, and he's volunteered with us for our family days for nearly 3 years now. And you'll also see him in our reenactment of the Salem Witch Trials this Sunday at 3 p.m. For our Salem Witch Trials Family Day event. So let's enjoy this performance and reading by Victor. And again, I want to thank you all for joining me and for being a member of the History Center. So without further ado, please enjoy The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, performed by Victor Lawrence.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness, peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flit and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door. Perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. Perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," said I, "art sure no craven. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering in from nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for We cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely upon the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken. Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster till his song's one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat, engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease, reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight glowed o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall pass, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee by these angels, he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from my heart and take thy form off from my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. All his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.